Why did the Union win the Civil War? So before we talk about that, I'm going to just take a few minutes and talk about background information about the Civil War. So the Civil War took place in April, and it marked the official start in April of 1861, and it didn't actually end until May of 1865. And there were, of course, two sides. So there was the Union and the Confederacy. And the Union was made up of the northern states, who were mostly against any ideas regarding slavery and wanted to go against the Confederacy, which was the southern states who rejected any ideas of abolishing slavery. So there were, in fact, some advantages that the Confederacy had, but as we go through them and then we compare them to the Union advantages, we'll see that the Confederacy advantages just didn't match up to the ones that the Union had. So one advantage the Confederacy had was their geographic advantage. So they were able to defend from their own territory, and in a war it's much easier to defend than to try and attack. And they were hoping that this strong advantage would lead to the Union losing the will to fight, and they would just give up and think that they would not be able to win because they would have to be attacking the whole time, but obviously we know that that is not the case. Another Confederate advantage would be that the Confederate had military leaders that had a lot of experience within these kind of leadership roles. And one more was the Confederate Army had won the first Battle of Bull Run in 1861, so that had gotten their energy up a little bit, and the Union thought that they had won the battle when they thought the Confederates were retreating, but actually they were only retreating to have reinforcements come in and overthrow the Union, so that's how they won that battle. So then we're going to talk about the Union advantages. So the Union's advantage that was probably the biggest was their population. They actually held 23 states compared to the Confederacy that only had 11. And 4 of the states that the Union was made up of were, in fact, border states. So it meant that they bordered the line between here where the Union and the Confederacy were. The overall population of the Union was approximately 11.2 million, while the Confederacy was only 9 million. So they just had overall more manpower than the Confederacy did, and they had much more territory based on the number of states that they were made up of. They also were responsible for producing 96% of all railroad systems, and they were all, of course, linked together, which provided them with very easy access to supplies and uniforms from the factory. They would just get it shipped directly to them right there, and it wasn't a problem because they produced almost 100%. They also were responsible for 97% of all firearms produced. So any firearm basically went to the Union because they produced it. The South was only responsible for producing 7% of all manufactured goods. 7% compared to 96 and 97 is obviously not a lot. So the Confederacy was at a huge disadvantage with this. And this is just a chart of the resources that the Union and the Confederacy had access to. And you can obviously see that population was much higher for the Union. Manufactured goods was much higher. Exports was almost pretty equal, but still more for the Union. Merchant ships was way more for Union. Miles of railroad tracks was way more. Grain production, number of farms, iron production, and banking capital. So pretty much on every level, the Union was just more together. They had more things, more resources, more people, everything like that. Another advantage that the Union had was they had 90 warships within their navy, and the Confederacy had not even created an actual official navy when the war began. And the Union used these ships to gain control of many rivers, such as the Mississippi River, pictured here, and tributaries, which provided them with extremely easy access for invasions, and they could just sail on the rivers or in the tributaries and have surprise attacks that the South would not even see coming. So some Union strategies that they used to win the war. Their first strategy was to just immediately capture the capital of Richmond before doing anything else. So obviously they just went straight for Richmond and tried to conquer that. They set up naval blockades, which allowed for easy defense of the Union territory, and it also cut off a lot of supply shipments to the Confederate Army. So the Union, owning almost all of the railroads, would get their supplies relatively easily, but the Confederate would have to rely on ships to bring them their supplies of uniforms or anything else that they would need. And while the Union would do the naval blockade, it would cut off a ton of supply shipments to the Confederate. So just some more advantages that aren't as clear-cut for the Union. The slaves began running away from their slave owners, and when they would run away, they would often join the Union's pursuit to eliminate slavery. So that would just give them even more manpower that they didn't have to recruit. They just came on their own free will to help fight for this. Another one was the Union victory at the Battle of Shiloh and the Battle of Perryville. They were responsible for keeping the morale of the soldiers high, and after winning 2 battles, you can imagine that they were feeling pretty good about themselves. So then came along the Emancipation Proclamation, and that was on January 1st, 1863, and President Lincoln signed the proclamation, and he stated, quote, "All slaves in the rebel states were to be made forever free." And while it didn't actually free all of the enslaved people within the Union states, it did spark a movement where they decided that they were just going to declare their own freedom. So then there was a turning point in the war, and the Union victory at the Battle of Vicksburg was responsible for splitting the Confederacy in two, so it allowed for even less access than they had before to supplies and manpower. And they also had another victory at the Battle of Gettysburg, which the Confederacy lost a third of its population of troops, which is a hefty amount when they were already down manpower. And this led to the Confederacy focus on defense rather than attacking, so they had to go back to their original strategy of just defending, and they could not even think about attacking. So then eventually we get to the Confederate surrender. So the Union captured both Georgia and South Carolina, and this led to even less Southern resistance, and eventually it led to the actual surrender of General Lee in 1865, which meant that the Union had won the Civil War.